I'm Adam Butterfield. I'm with South Valley Sewer District. I've been in pretreatment about 15 years now. Originally worked for Salt Lake City for about 6 years and currently been where I'm at for about 9. I've dealt with kind of almost every industry you can think of categorical. When I worked for Salt Lake City, we had 81 SIU CIUs. When I left there, we had over 100 because we found a bunch and stuff like that in my short time there. Currently dealing with, this is one of my big ones of SIUs and stuff like that, and a lot of people don't have slaughterhouses, so it's kind of interesting. If you don't like basically what happens to animals, I'm sorry. But like I said, this is very interesting to me to see what goes on, why it goes on, and the end product and stuff like that. Especially comes into pre-treatment and stuff like that, because we all know that our plants can only handle a certain amount of waste strength. So that's the main thing with this is if you're getting one of these, which currently the one I'm discussing actually just closed down as of this last month. They actually kind of got pushed out because my area is building up with lots of homes, lots of apartment complexes, and actually they were building an apartment complex right next to the slaughterhouse, and they bought out the property for the slaughterhouse to build another one on top of it. So, but like I said, this is very interesting. So, of course I'm going to put a warning on here. Say, some viewers may find this disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. So, so this is not the type of slaughterhouse we're talking about, even though we're coming close to Halloween and stuff like that. And that's what people think. Big guy with this big butcher knife and stuff like that. It's a lot different. So, of course, oh no. So one of the things that I like to talk about anytime I talk about understanding a business and stuff like that, I like to talk about basically breaking it down to what you really need to do during an inspection. I like to basically break it down to the smallest thing, so some of you who have never done it, or if you've only been doing it a year, you understand the basics. So one of the most important things is you may need a permit. So you need to understand what you're looking at. I always like to go over what's the base material? What process are they going to perform throughout the whole thing? What's water being used for? The configuration, if we're talking like metal finishing or what metalers do and stuff like that. What's the date the first discharge? Is it a new discharge? Is it one that's been doing it for years? Or have they changed their process so all of a sudden it changes that? Amount material used is very important, or volume of wastewater discharge, or if there's any exceptions once you understand what you're looking at. Because there are always a bunch of categorical exceptions that some people miss those. I know I did, until I was questioned about one of my industries and found out there was an exception, and that's why they fit into that category. So, of course, I want to go over safety. Slaughterhouses are a very dangerous place. You got knives, you got hooks, and these can be in spots where wet floor, very important. I've seen hooks basically like right here on the ground holding basically meat and everything else, and it's like, oh, wet floor. Guess what? That could be an accident waiting to happen. And actually what I also forgot to include, acids. Because we're talking people are using metals and everything else. They're using it for sanitation. So there can be that. So of course, a slaughterhouse, we're talking about cattle. So the first thing to understand about what the slaughterhouse, at least I was dealing with, is they're dealing with dairy cows. The reason they're dealing with dairy cows is basically they wait till basically the cow can no longer produce milk. Once they're no longer viable for milk, they're actually brought to the slaughterhouse. So of course, a truck picks it up and brings them to there. Then they throw them into basically a corral. And the thing to understand about this is the water. What's water going to be used for? Like I said, the base material, that's the cattle. Now what's water going to be used for? Okay, when you're doing this and stuff like that, especially if you're going to end up surcharging or whatever for the waste strength, how much water is going to basically give those cows while they wait? because those cows can be waiting there for days. Are you going to all of a sudden charge them for all the water going in when half of it's going to basically into the cows? So that's one of the nice things that the previous people thought about before I took over and stuff like that was they had separate meters. They had a meter basically that went to what feeds the cows, which was nice. Because then when I calculated my surcharge and everything else, I didn't have to worry about that point. It was like, okay, guess what? That goes to the cow, whereas that goes to the cows to wash them off, and that goes on the ground. So you didn't have to worry about that as much. But depends on the facility. There are slaughterhouses that basically put all their cattle into basically where all the water that washes on them and stuff like that actually goes down the drain. And so that's another worry of, okay, is it going to the sewer or is it just going right on top of the ground? Luckily, when they were washing off a bunch of the cows before they went into the facility, it was going on the ground for my area. So I didn't have to worry about it as much. Okay, so like I said, this is a little bit disturbing. It says a kill room. Unfortunately, it is a slaughterhouse, so there's going to be the kill room. They'll put them in the guide, and basically that guide will basically take them into a room that what's going to happen is basically it's going to lock these cows in place because they're going to be killed. And what they do is they'll take a large spike that has an electric current, and actually it goes right through the brain and actually shocks them and kills them in one quick swoop. Like I said, a little bit disturbing, but it's quick. It's a little bit painful for a second, but it's over quickly and as humane as possible. That way you're not basically putting them with drugs or anything that could affect the meat and everything else. So now, after that, they're led into what's called the bleeding room, because that's something you don't want in your meat right then. So what happens here is they actually basically tie the hind legs up, and they actually lift the cow by its hind legs. What they'll do is then they'll actually cut the throat of the cow. And basically, since the legs are lifted up, the blood will drain. And of course, you don't want that down the drain because what's blood high in? BOD. The other thing about this kind of stuff, people don't realize, that's a usable product for them. I really didn't understand this until I took a course on basically history and economics. Basically, they teach you in that kind of stuff. A lot of these places don't make much of their profits on the meat itself. They actually almost sell it for cost. A lot of the other byproducts is where they make their money. And that's kind of the stuff I'll try to basically show you and tell you about and stuff like that. So like this, they have a special floor drain that goes to a pit. And like I said, this is basically the bleeding area. This is basically a usable product that a lot of people don't realize is in much of your products already is cow blood. I won't go into it because you can do the research on your own and stuff like that, because some of the products you may not ingest anymore and stuff like that. It's to change color. It's to those kind of things and stuff like that. But they basically save all that blood to haul away for further processing. So it is a usable product for them. Next, what they do is actually they will cut off the head. They'll remove the head. And the reason what they do with this, they actually take it out for testing. That's when you start hearing about, oh, these places have mad cow disease and stuff like that, because the FDA is very worried about stuff like that. So they actually basically take the head. A little bit disturbing, they do cut out the tongues for a usable product as part meat. People will buy that stuff as meat. So I personally don't know if I've ever ate it, but probably all of us have in some way or another. If you eat meat, who knows? Depending on what restaurants you go to and what meat they buy, you never know. Because we'll discuss some of the other byproducts. So the next thing they're going to do is actually remove the hide. They'll actually basically just kind of pull the hide off and stuff like that, and they'll save it. The unfortunate thing about hides anymore, though, so these hides are actually set off to become leather. The problem with leather anymore is how many of us use leather as much as we used to. The other thing is There's not any processing facilities in the United States anymore because of how bad leather tanning, the chemicals are used in it and stuff like that. So actually, the facility I had to send it to China. The problem is, because not many people are using leather, they don't want it anymore. So one of their profit margins is going away. Because they used to get paid for this stuff a lot of money when leather was big. Now, not so much. So that's kind of why this facility started to shut down, is the more costs go up on some of this stuff, or where they're losing profits and stuff like that, and people pushing them out. So more rural areas will see more of these places popping up in your area. So just be aware of this kind of stuff. Like I said, they'll make, of course, boots, gloves, still out of leather and stuff like that, but more are going to synthetic and other products. Next, they basically slice it open and pull out the organs. Pretty easy to understand, that kind of stuff, but they'll, of course, separate it. People want different organs for different purposes. Some people like liver, some people like heart for consumption. The other thing is they'll process some of them on site. They, of course, have to wash it all down. So this is where water starts to really come into play. Because you still now that you bled out a lot of the veins and stuff like that, but there's other things as you're cutting out the organs that there's going to be blood in there. So now some of that residual is going to come into play. So they're going to start washing it down more and more. You'll have a little bit before when they wash off the animal as they come in, but this is where they're going to start really using water. One of the things that they do process, at least at my facility, is the stomachs. And they have to, of course, pull all the material out of there. This stuff's called paunch. This is all the acids, all the grass, all the material the animals consumed. It kind of looks like this, as I turn off the projectors. So it's this green stuff. Here's where your TSS comes into play. You got these fine particles of like hay, grass, and other things that basically these people are feeding them. But what I want to warn you about this kind of stuff, depending on the area this stuff's coming from, that the animal's consuming, you may have problems with different types of metals. You may have problems with different chemicals, pesticides. We actually just realized that at my facility. We were doing a test and they're like, wait a second, this one came up, this basically almost pesticide came up high. Why? We started doing research and figured out that it was the product that was going into the cows from a certain stock. Luckily, like I said, now the slaughterhouse has gone away, so we don't have to worry about telling them, guess what, you can't take it from that farmer or whatever that's putting that stuff on there. But that can be a concern, kind of a thing. And like I said, the TSS is a big deal. The facility I was actually dealing with had a huge surcharge for BOD, TSS, and oil and grease. And they didn't have much screening in their drains and stuff like that. They weren't capturing enough of this paunch material. Went in there, saw their floor drains, and I'm like, why aren't you capturing this inside? They were like, well, no one really mentioned that. We have grease interceptors outside that will catch solids, but it's like, well, you're paying a company to pump out your grease interceptor and you're paying them a lot of money when you can capture a lot of it right here. The reason I mention this is we do it for a lot of our restaurants. We tell them, basically put in some screens, put in some fine screens that will catch a lot of this stuff. They actually reduced their TSS quite a bit just by doing this. They basically went around all their floor drains in any room that they had any kind of TSS and just started throwing those in place. You want to make sure when you tell them, put in these type of screens, look at the particles you're dealing with. This paunch, can it fit through those holes? I tell the restaurants the same thing. If you're basically going to put in a screen like this to remove TSS to help your grease interceptor, take a grain of rice, because how many people at a restaurant have rice? That's the first thing I find in grease interceptors when I sledge judge them, is a ton of rice. And that's one of the smaller particles. You go, if a piece of rice can fit through that, guess what? You have the wrong type of screen in your drain. Because you don't want to fill your basically grease interceptors up with solids. You want to fill it up with grease, because then your maintenance is less. It doesn't overload it, because your interceptors can only handle so much. So, like I said, they put these in, work pretty good. And you'll see the number. I won't show you the previous numbers. Forgot to put those with my presentation. But when you see the numbers currently, you'd be surprised that they actually got better. So, like I said, they take the stomachs out and have to further process them. After they pull that paunch out and stuff like that, and they're throwing a ton of this in the garbage cans and everything else, they're, of course, rinsing it out because they're pulling the stomachs and turning them inside out to clean all that material out, because they're going to use this as a product to sell. Well, the next thing they do is they actually bleach them. They actually will put these, basically, stomachs in bleach to make them almost look kind of like a off-white. Because the thing they're going to make out of it is, who's ever had menudo? That's what menudo is. That's cow stomach. That's your meat in that. Kind of interesting fact and stuff like that. Made me not want to try it, because I saw how it was processed, but that's just me. Maybe you won't notice. The other thing, when they're cutting these open and they find all the organs and stuff like that, they'll actually find baby calves sometimes. Yeah, it's sad that you're losing this calf, but like I said, they find ways to basically reuse these calves. They'll actually, when they pull out a lot of the blood, since the calf is still developing, they actually pull out the stem cells. Come on, we've all heard about stem cell research. Regrowing nerves, regrowing limbs from stem cells. This is where the research comes from. They basically sell this to universities and everything else, so it's like, yes, you're losing that calf, but guess what? They're basically sending out for stem cell research. That could be revolutionary eventually. Because, of course, stem cells can change into anything, depending on what it goes into and what it stimulates. So it's kind of nice that that's where the research comes from. So now that everything kind of has been basically cut off that isn't been used and stuff like that, like the head, the hide, the organs and stuff like that, now you're down to really the meat. So, like I said, throughout that whole process, they're rinsing it off and stuff like that. Now they have to set it into coolers. The nice thing is they'll throw stuff on it. They'll actually spray the carcass with special chemicals, so no bugs, nothing basically come and get near it. And of course, it's safe for meat to have it on it and stuff like that, because they're going to eventually rinse that off in other processes again and stuff like that. So it may sit there for a couple days or something like that in coolers to keep the meat below the certain temperature it's supposed to be. After that, after it's been sitting for a while in these coolers and stuff like that, it's set off to the cutting room. Again, this is where we're going to get more solids. We've really got basically down to the point there's no BOD really and stuff like that from it and stuff like that. So now you're to the cutting room. This is where, depending on who's buying the meat, what cuts they're going to do on this meat, depending on who they're doing it for. So they'll take some of it and just send the whole half of the calf basically right out the door, depending on who's buying it and stuff like that. Or they'll cut it into the different types of meat you want. You want ribs? Okay. They're going to cut it to that point on the customer they have and stuff like that. And like I said, there's a lot of floor drains in this area because they got to sanitize later on. And I'll get into that a little bit more later on about the sanitization of this process. And then, of course, once they do the cuts and everything else, it's packaged and ready to go out the door. And then, actually, this facility was kind of interesting. So if you wanted fresh meat, you could actually buy it on site. They'd actually sell it right at the door. There was many times I was waiting to do my inspections and people were lining up in the door to buy their meat. And they'd sell pretty much anything. You wanted the heart, you wanted the liver, you wanted the tongue. Yeah. It was surprising how much of that stuff was going out the door. So. Then there's these other things that I really didn't go over yet. It's called inedibles. These are like basically the hooves. These are basically like the bone and everything else. Truckloads of this stuff. So the facility I would inspect did about 160 cows per day. So that was a lot of, they had a big basically truck out there that all this material was just thrown out on a conveyor and put into the truck for haul away. But just because it's inedible doesn't mean it's not a product. So a lot of their other stuff, basically, you would look at and, okay, the fats. Guess what? They were cutting off a lot of the big pieces of fat. Well, what's fat turned into? Soaps. That was one of the first things I learned in this history class that talked about the economics of it. This stuff used to actually go a lot of times to the rivers. And the rivers used to be polluted with this stuff because no one understood, you know what, we'll just throw it out the door because we're making the money on the meat. Then basically people started learning, you know what, if I can reuse this stuff that basically is a waste product, guess what, I can make money and undercut the other guy. That's where I was talking about, a lot of times these places are selling the meat at cost. Whatever it costs them to buy that, basically get that cattle from that person or give that person the money for the cattle. Like I said, this is where their profit starts to come in. You're having this big truck leave there that's got a lot of this material, and they're sending it to another facility to process. But they're making a lot of money off of that. And you'll see how much this facility paid us just to treat their wastewater. And let's just say it was quite a bit. So here's just kind of a little table of the inedible rendering, stuff like that. So cows, just the tallow, which is a product they can use, 10 to 20% of the cow. That was a lot of material that was going off basically as an inedible originally. The protein solids, 20 to 30%. A lot of material that was just basically previously being thrown away. That they try to use everything they can to make up their profit margin. So, like I said, I was talking about basically most of the water for what they were doing during the daytime when they were cutting up the meat. So their operation runs basically Monday through Friday, pretty much 24 hours through that Monday through Friday. But they can only do about 16 hours of that of processing. At that point, basically the FDA and everything says you cannot process anymore. Now you got to do sanitization. So now that basically they send most of their workforce home. Because guess what? Everything now has to be sanitized for the next group of cows. So basically they nightly for about 8 hours, they are scrubbing every single portion of that facility because you never know where basically the blood went to. As the guys are cutting it, there's blood. So they're walking through the facility. So they have to sanitize everything so they don't cross-contaminate the meat. So yeah, they spend, I can't remember if I have on this presentation the number of workers they have, but they had, I think, a crew of between 10 and 16 guys that just sanitize at night for 8 hours. One of the things that I also wanted to point out, this facility actually dipped their hooks in acids. They'd actually take acids and hurry and dip their hooks in and stuff like that. So that's why I said the safety on, basically you could be around a 55-gallon drum of acid that they're using to clean their hooks with. Luckily, since it's just an acid cleaning process, it's not a metal finishing process. They're not doing it to basically form that layer. They're just putting it in to hurry and clean it and sanitize it really quickly. And they'll let it air dry off. And they'll actually put it over the acid drum so they collect the material back as much as possible. As far as this one with treatment, so this facility actually was a very old facility. Currently, they're on the third generation of who was running it at the time. Basically, they closed down. It was basically the grandfather who started it, the father who ran it, and then the nephew who is currently running it. Previously, they had only a 500-gallon interceptor. Then the pre-treatment coordinator for South Valley Water Reclamation came along and had to put them in another one. That was still not enough treatment, and they were still causing problems for the plant. They had them put in a 3,000-gallon interceptor. So there's good things about this and bad things about this. So how much usually does a pumper truck hold? Usually they don't hold 3,000 gallons. Yeah, usually like 2,500. So every time a pumper truck would actually come out to this facility to pump out that one interceptor, usually the guy wasn't thinking and might pump out basically the second chamber on it first and basically leave 500 gallons. Well, they usually have to do that when they're processing. So what happens? They're not getting that 500 gallons that are in the first tank, so they're leaving a lot of solids. It can be a problem. I had discussed it. Hey, you pump out the first one, by the time the other truck's there, you might not be to the second one yet. But with the amount of wastewater this facility uses per day, very unlikely. So it was one of those things of when you're helping somebody to think of these kind of things, you may want to look at those kind of obstacles. It's one of those things that, yeah, a 3,000-gallon interceptor looks good on paper. Trust me, I've had previous ones that put in 5,000-gallon as one tank. Now, over review of that, I'm like, that was probably a bad idea of allowing them to put just a 5,000-gallon. You may want to have them do a series of these. Thinking about the pumpers who are now have to pump those out. Because at least with the series of them, you can basically say, hey, pump the first series first. By the time you get to another truck here, it hasn't gone, it's only filled up the first series, not the second series. Maybe options you want to think about on sizing grease interceptors. Not go too large because the pumpers can't handle it. And stuff like that. You can do multiple, not a problem. Or you never know. Hey, have half of the process go to one, half of the process go to the other and see what it does. So it doesn't basically isn't as large. Really on this, I'm trying to just help the facility with what I dealt with. I'm not saying anyone did anything wrong. Trust me, I've done probably stupider things than most people on some of these facilities, but that's why I'm trying to teach from that experience of learning these things. These are things you gain experience on and go, hey, you know what? When I saw it afterwards, yes, it didn't work. Good experience to learn, to explain to somebody else on what mistakes I've made. So here's a kind of a facility diagram. It's hard to see and stuff like that. So cattle would come over here, a little past here. This is basically their maintenance area. They'd come over here, through here to be washed, and then kill room, then basically where they do blood, the finishing process. And you can see one interceptor here, and the 3,000 gallon here. So I like to show this whenever I talk about grease interceptors. A lot of people, you see a grease interceptor, it really until visually you see what it actually does, it helps to understand. I like to show a lot of people, I do tours at my facility. This is how a grease interceptor works. You go to a restaurant, here's what it's going to do. Since food's going to basically have a higher specific gravity, it's going to fall to the bottom. Your fats, oil, and grease, lighter, guess what? They go to the top. And I like to show restaurants this when I can, so they understand what's going on out there. As the flow goes through, it's just going to slowly fill up and settle out material. And the better you define that kind of stuff or refine your designs on what you allow, it will help your lines out better. And actually, most of the time I just take a picture of this overall to show them. Because as I'm explaining it to them, they look down and all they see is sewer manholes. So it really helps out when you have a picture of what they see on top of a restaurant or a place like a slaughterhouse of, you have a grease interceptor. Do you know how it works? No, I have no clue how it works or what's going on. When you start explaining, well, this is really just a detention tank to basically slow down the flow for this material to settle out. Oh, really? Okay. Helps them understand if you have to regulate them for it. Or when their numbers are high, why their numbers are high based on if the pumper's not doing right. Because like I said, if this is a 3,000 gallon and he's only getting 2,500 of it, there's all that material on the bottom. And like I said, when you start seeing the TSS numbers on the slaughterhouse, that 500 gallons means a lot to him. So with this maintenance, and this was quite an expensive maintenance program for this facility, every Monday they would have the 3,000 gallon interceptor pumped. Basically every Wednesday they had both 500 gallons pumped. Pumper was happy. They had basically a stable business. Business wasn't happy though, because the simple fact now, he's paying for every time these have to be pumped out. So, and when you see the surcharge amount, I don't blame him. Kind of a thing. And once I show you per year, like I said, this business has been in business for a long time. They've been regulated for a long time. Probably since pre-treatment's been around, and maybe even before. I don't know. I'd have to ask the people who took over, did it originally and stuff like that. They have better records, and I know they have great records. They gave me a bunch of them. I didn't take all of them when I took over this facility. So here's just the BOD numbers for basically the last little while. I kind of did it by the first half of the year because we were only able to sample twice a year. But their flow and their waste strength changed dramatically. You look at 2011, the first half sample was 1,789. Second half, look at that number, 11,829 on BOD. Yeah. Slowly over time, as they progressed some of their methods and stuff like that, some of the numbers got better. We did point out a few things as we were walking through the facility they could kind of improve. So you will see the variability was closer in the end. The other thing you have to worry about this, we're talking chemicals, and some pretty nasty ones for sanitization. You may not just want to do BOD. Because what happens when you have very harmful chemicals and you do a BOD? The numbers can come out low, and surprisingly low, depending on what chemicals they're using and at what time and how much they put down the drain at the time. So we actually went to more of a COD and a BOD at the same time to see if they were matching. I had actually learned this from when I worked for Salt Lake City, basically when we were doing soap manufacturing on a facility. The previous people there had only done BOD. Well, guess what? When you start understanding the soap manufacturing regulations, there's a correlation between BOD and COD that has to be maintained. It's basically, if it's beyond 1 to 10, guess what? They violate. And that's one of the things that caught me thinking about this with most industries. What are they using to clean? If you're just doing BOD, could your BOD end up low because of the chemicals they're using? Because, like I said, here's the numbers for 2018. Is it still that 2 to 1? Not every time. I've got some other sample results that I didn't put up here, but they were not always that way, depending on the day. And usually most BOD-COD ratios are close to that, or at least 1 to 1.5. So it's a good correlation to do if you're basically suspecting chemicals are upsetting any BODs you're doing. Are there harmful chemicals that could basically wipe out the seeds? Like I said, here's some of the TSS numbers. You can see clear back here, look at that. As it gone on, you can see right around here. As I had them do more screens, and a lot of it actually came down to, they put the screens in place. But what happens when you put screens in place and you don't basically tell everybody they got to take care of them other than the sanitation crew? Because they're going, hey, those plugged off. Well, guess what? You got to clean those often. That material basically is just getting pushed through. I like to compare it to basically, everyone probably played with Play-Doh. If you ever played with that spaghetti, basically, line on it and stuff like that, I compared those screens to that. Basically, the more pressure you put on it, the more material is going to keep going through those holes because of the pressure behind it. So the more they clean the screens, the better their numbers end up. And you can see the most recent TSS loadings. And when you're talking money, and like I said, there was a lot of money going to us for what they were putting down the drain. This mattered. Because all they have to do on this is basically buy the screen once, for the most part, for years, and make sure the employees maintain it. Yeah, it's kind of interesting on those screens also for my restaurants. So we actually decreased the H2S at our plant since I've been at my facility. The way we decreased our H2S is by helping decrease the solids from grease interceptors. And the way we decreased solids from grease interceptors and everything else was having restaurants putting screens like that. Because that was that correlation of food breaking down, that basically the bacteria that's eating up the food produces H2S, which would go into our lines. And we've seen a huge decrease in that kind of material in our lines. A lot of the interceptors we used to sample before, no H2S compared to previously, there was quite a bit of readings. So, like I said, these screens help them out quite a bit as we get into the others. And then you can see oil and grease was variable. So we have 1,000 milligrams per liter limit on basically total oil and grease at our area. You can see one of the first samples we did was 947. They had a blip right there, was 721. But overall, you can see as we taught them more and more techniques, it helped out decrease some of their oil and grease also. Because the more solids that have been removed, it operated the grease interceptor better, which helped its removal efficiency. Because it's basically a lot of those gravity ones are based off of a 25% rule, at least the manufacturers say. Well, if you fill up at 25% with solids, guess what? Where does the oil and grease have place to go? Because it needs that 75% to settle out that material. It goes right through. So the more food you keep out of there, the better your grease interceptor runs, which is shown. As far as petroleum, since there's a lot of basically products around there running the ACs and everything else, we did see a little bit of hits on there that was over our limit. Unfortunately, we don't, because of how our facility handles BOD TSS, we really don't have a BOD TSS limit because we're nowhere close to our loadings. So that's why I didn't say there was really a BOD TSS, but you can see as far as petroleum, we are worried about that. So they did have a few blips on that. They did figure out that it was probably one of their products that they were told was food grade. Had some petroleum products in it. Because they were trying to use stuff that was all food grade. They tried to change over other than their acid. Everything was supposed to just be food grade. They did look through it and figure out, what, after the second one, they're like, it must be this food grade product we're using in our machines. So this facility uses about 50,000 gallons per day of water. That's a lot of water, especially for a 3,000 gallon and two 500 gallon interceptors. So it was about 1 million gallons per month we were receiving. So when you start thinking of that in the BOD, COD numbers, wait till you see their bill. Here's their sewer bill. So on COD alone, $12,000 per month. TSS, almost $4,000 per month. Their domestic was $2,500. That calculated to, in 2019, they paid us $183,000 for sewer service. Number looks great for our accountant, but the thing I worry about facilities is, so as this facility has left my area, they basically contacted almost every city around my area to change over. Every time an accountant sees this number, they're all on board. Come to our basically city. Come basically to our treatment plant. We're happy to accept your wastewater. The question is no one's ever seen the other numbers, so every city had to contact me going, I want all their numbers on how much waste strength, how much they're going to put down as far as pounds of BOD. Can my facility handle it? So far, I have not heard that they've got a new place to go. Because every facility around mine is like, hey, we can't handle that much. So, and that's why I say, some of these variabilities also, how many of your plants can handle variable loads on waste strength? Depending on your small facilities. Depending on if you're a large facility, yeah, you can handle it. We could handle it. I had no problem handling it and stuff like that. But I worry for the small communities these have to move to. Can your plants handle this? So let's talk about regulations. There's a point source category in the CFRs. How many of you have actually looked at this point source category? Come on, anyone looked at this point source category? Lindsay has. Well, if they're coming to your facility, you may want to just quickly glance through. Because of course it comes down to, okay, is it a simple one? Is it a complex one? Where are my regulations? You got to read through this stuff. Simple, pretty easy. 1 or 2 processes only besides the meat cutting. Is it basically removing the paunch? Is it rendering? Is it basically making the soap? What is it doing? That's why I say worry about this kind of stuff. How many? Is it complex? Because basically, like Sarah was saying, you need to understand, if you go to permit them, your justification. Because if there is regulations on this, you need to explain why you did what you did, which category you put them under. Complex, is there multiple facilities? Are they processing quite a bit? So luckily, slaughterhouses are reserved. Hopefully everyone knows what reserve means on this, but I'll kind of say is, it really just says there are no regulations currently, at least for basically POTWs. But if you're a state, there is. So that's why I say for most of us, we're pre-treatment, so we don't have to worry about it, at least for the regulations as they're a CIU. Mine, I had to worry about it because it was an SIU. 50,000 gallons above 25,000 gallons. Guess what? Automatically made me have to regulate them as an SIU. So, of course, like I said, mine was flow, but you never know. If they could be a smaller facility, could they be organically loading you? I've seen multiple places that could organically load a place that they had to regulate that way because of the BOD. We actually had one facility when I was in Salt Lake City. They made basically like fruit pies, those apple cherry pies that you buy basically at the gas station. The glaze on those. So we were doing a test one day, set out our sampler, we pull it up, and it was actually kind of funny because usually it comes out kind of cloudy. I'm looking at this thing, it's basically almost crystal clear water. I'm like, wow, this is probably going to end up pretty good. Boy, was I wrong. So when the test came back, it was 40,000 plus on BOD. The lab basically couldn't do it. I was like, okay, went back to him and said, we have a limit of 10,000 when I was in Salt Lake City. I was like, you basically went 4 times over the limit, and it has a plus on there, so you could have gone even higher than that. Come to find out, they did a glazing operation on those pies, that little nice glaze on top. They decided to test that, the pure product. 180,000 on beauty. So it wasn't much, it wouldn't take much to go down the drain. We actually figured out that they were basically taking a baking sheet about this big every single day out afterwards, because we figured out it was their basically tray that was moving it along that had the glaze stuck to it. So there's little things like this if you notice, because that's the first thing I told this company when I walked in. That's what I'm trying to tell you is if you notice something, mention it. Have them investigate it. It could help them out.